Okay, hi guys. So we're going to continue talking about different ways that evolution can occur. So I'm just going to review first and then we'll get into some new stuff here. Um, on Monday, I had asked you to do some reading and answer some questions. And when you did that reading, you should have noticed these 5 different conditions that was mentioned. If these 5 conditions, if any of them are met, then that means that evolution is occurring in a population. Okay, so those 5 conditions were mutation. If mutation is present, it introduces variability, and that changes the gene frequencies in a population. Non-random mating, we'll talk about more today. Gene flow and finite population size, again, we're going to review this content, and then natural selection you should be pretty comfortable with at this point. Okay, so mutation and natural selection. Like I said, we've talked about this quite a bit. So basically, when a mutation shows up in a population, you're going to have some variability in that population. This is a mutant and this is a mutant. If this one is not favorable for the particular environment that that individual lives in, that mutant is more likely to die without reproducing and passing those genes along to offspring in the next generation. If the mutation is favorable, that person or that individual is more likely to reproduce, and then that allele frequency will get higher and higher in subsequent generations just because the longer they live, the more they're reproducing, and the more frequent that allele is going to show up in future generations. Okay, so when you did the simulation yesterday, you were really looking at something called genetic drift. Okay, so I'm going to give you that definition and then explain it. Genetic drift is variation in the relative frequency of different genotypes in a small population, owing to the chance disappearance of particular genes as individuals die off or do not reproduce. Okay, so when you were doing the simulation, you had a lot of individuals present in the mainland, and then you had a few individuals present on each of the 2 islands, right? So what the simulation was having you do was select 5 random individuals from the mainland to populate one island, and another 5 random individuals to populate island 2. You let them mate over time, and you saw that these gene frequencies on the island did not necessarily reflect the same numbers that the mainland gene frequencies did. So if you see on island number 2 here, there's a lot of yellow and green alleles, but in the mainland there's a lot more red and purples that do not show up here. So that's just random chance, right? So we just chose individuals from the mainland, 5 individuals, that happened not to be red and blue. If you look at island 1, there's a couple of red individuals here, but there's not as many as there are green and yellow, right? So if I continue the simulation over time, it is possible that those red individuals would die without having had the chance to reproduce. And if that happens, those alleles would die off, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that those red alleles are disadvantageous to living on island 1. It doesn't mean that, natural selection was working against them. It's just random chance. And the smaller a population is, the more susceptible it is to those random chance extinction of alleles over time. So this is another way that evolution can occur by genetic drift. And genetic drift is more likely with smaller populations. Gene flow is migration. So again, this simulation also covered migration, right? You just had 5 random individuals migrate to an island. If we had inbreeding between these 2 islands, that would again change gene frequencies in each island. So migration can change allele frequencies over time, causing evolution. Okay, so what we're going to focus on mostly today is that requirement of non-random mating, right? So if non-random mating occurs, that's also going to cause evolution. So non-random mating is just defined as when the probability that 2 individuals in a population will mate is not the same for all possible pairs of individuals. So there's a few reasons why this would occur. The first reason is called sexual selection. Charles Darwin, in The Origin of Species, he wrote that the sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick. Okay, so you've all seen peacocks, pictures of peacocks, you've seen them in nature documentaries or at the zoo. They have these huge, gorgeous tails, right? In nature, this thing would slow them down. It would make them much more susceptible to predators. They do not run as fast, they cannot fly, right? So you would think that this would be selected against because it reduces their probability of survival and then reproduction. Now, what we think the reason is for these large peacock tail feathers is called sexual selection. So there was actually an experiment done by a woman who owned a peacock farm, and she cut all of the colorful eyelets off of some of the tail feathers of the male peacocks that she owned, and she left the other ones alone. If the males had their tail feathers trimmed, the females were less likely to choose them as a mate. So females prefer to mate with male peacocks who have these large, colorful feathers, and that's why this gene for tail feathers has continued to increase in the population. And there's tons of examples of this. I'm going to give you a few more just because they're pretty interesting. A frog, so in the summertime you can hear frogs croaking, right, making ribbit noises. That makes them more noticeable to predators in the population as well, right? So you would think that would be selected against. But again, that's a mating call. So the reason why they make that noise is because they're trying to attract female mates. Deer, when they have these huge antlers and they get into scuffle, male deer will like butt heads with each other. They're not trying to hurt each other. They're just trying to show off how strong they are. And females prefer to mate with deers with the largest antlers and the ones who win this battle here. On your right, this is a GIF of an animal called a hooded seal, which is a really weird one. He has this bubble in his nostril that he inflates, and he waves it around, and the male with the largest nose bubble is more likely to get a mate than the male with the smaller nose bubble. So this is a trait that is sexually selected for. Okay, other reasons why non-random mating is important. Inbreeding is when individuals who are closely related mate. This can cause problems in populations. If the population gets very small, the likelihood of inbreeding is increased. So if we look here at the pedigree, A is the dominant allele, this big A, and little a is the recessive deleterious allele. So this means that this one is not good, right? If you have a heterozygote, then the dominant allele will cover up this recessive allele and it won't cause this horse any problems. If they mate with a dominant homozygous horse, then they're going to create offspring that are both heterozygotes and a homozygote dominant. If this heterozygote mates with its sibling, there's a possibility that their offspring will have two deleterious alleles, right? So this is called inbreeding. If this horse mates with a horse that is not related to it, this horse is less likely to share that recessive deleterious allele, so it's not going to show up in the subsequent generations. This is a big problem within the cheetah family. So these large cats, their population got very, very small as a result of different factors, and because of that, there's a lot of inbreeding. Cheetahs are very genetically similar, and that causes a lot of problems in producing healthy offspring. So this is one of the reasons that cheetahs are endangered. Another way that non-random mating can occur is by outbreeding. So a lot of times, individuals may prefer to mate with other individuals who are genetically distant from each other. I'm going to give an example here that I think is interesting of outbreeding. So the Capra ibex, it lived in the European Alps. It was endangered, a large result of hunting and poaching. And then there was another population of ibex that was doing fairly well in Australia. Okay, so scientists wanted to save this population of ibex because they knew that that population was not doing well. What they decided to do was borrow some individuals from the Australian Conservation Park and bring them over to this population to help increase their numbers and help create genetic diversity in that gene pool. So when that happened, these ibex, you can see like the terrain is much more arid, it's much warmer, whereas this environment was a lot colder and it was more mountainous. So they had different genes that were well adapted to their particular environments. When they brought these individuals over to this population to create a new generation, the babies were actually born earlier than they would have been if they had left them alone. So the Capra ibex and the Capra ibex nubia, they had babies that were born in the fall, which was much colder time of year, and there wasn't nearly as many plants around for them to eat. So all of those individuals died. So that was a big failure in terms of conservation effort, and it's really important, and we definitely look at that now when we're considering enhancing a gene pool of a particular population. We need to know if there's genes that are not well adapted to the new environment that you're implanting them in. So these were all examples of ways that non-random mating could cause evolution. And just to revisit those 5 requirements for evolution to occur, you either need mutation to introduce genetic variability, non-random mating, because if it's non-random, then you're going to get these weird traits, or you're going to get a higher frequency of deleterious alleles, or potentially you could be sharing different genes that are adapted to a particular environment. Okay, gene flow is migration. Finite population size is important because if it's a small population, then the chances of genetic drift or random changes in allele frequency is higher. And then natural selection, which you are all fairly comfortable with. So you should be comfortable with all of these terms at this point, and we'll review them again later this week.